Welcome back to Minor Things, a podcast where we explore corporate and everyday matters through the lens of three Asian Canadians. As always, these are the views of these three Asian Canadians because we don't speak for others. My name is Maria, and I am a pineapple. Prickly on the outside, sweet on the inside.
Hi, my name is Kim, and I'm a mango because everybody likes mangoes.
And my name is Max, and I am a watermelon. Hard exterior with a lot of stuff once you crack me open.
Oh, Max, you're awesome. In this episode of Minor Things, we are going to do something a little different and break down our thoughts about a recent book that we all read and had a lot of thoughts and opinions on. The book is called Yellowface by the author R.F. Kuang. We all have different views on the storyline and the plot twists within, so it will be interesting to deep dive into that. We do need to preface, though, that there will be spoilers ahead, so proceed with caution if you haven't or plan on reading this book. This episode will explore the themes of diversity, racism, and cultural appropriation, as well as the terrifying influence that social media can have on your own identity. So to set the stage, the quick synopsis of Yellowface is basically about a young white author who steals the manuscript of her dead Asian friend. She finishes writing it and publishes it as her own. Throughout the novel, Juniper, or June Haywood, publishing as Juniper San, works to maintain the lie that her first big hit novel, The Last Front, a story about Chinese workers in the British Army during World War I, is indeed her work and her work only. So Max and Kim, what are your thoughts about the book? Do you think it was controversial, in your opinion?
I just have to say that this is kind of like a book report that we're doing, and unlike other times,
get your dual tang ready.
Yeah. Unlike other times, I did not annotate anything, and I don't have my red duotang ready. I did enjoy this book quite a bit. I read it probably within a couple of days while I was holding my son as he was sleeping, and some days I wish that he slept longer so that I could read longer. With this book, though, I would have to say that when I first started reading it, I was skeptical. I thought that it was going to be cringy, to be honest. Wasn't too sure how victimizing it was going to be, and how much of it I was going to disagree with. Because I don't necessarily like stories where the minority is working on a narrative where they have a chip on their shoulder. But I would say with this book, though, there were a lot of allegories, and I did feel that at times the author was pretty good at making us feel bad about the supposed antagonist, which I think a lot of people would agree is June Hayward. But I hated that sometimes I sympathized with her. Before we get more into it, though, what were some of your initial feelings about it, Max?
So I listened to the audio version of this through Audible, and I wasn't the first one. It was actually my wife who had told me about the book. She read the first chapter on Amazon as a preview, and then when we were both going through it, we were like, "Wow, this is really compelling." But I think overall for the book, I think it starts extremely strong. And I think the character development was very interesting, especially knowing that the author is a Chinese person herself. And it starts by going into, this white author's head, and, some of the thoughts, the passive aggressiveness, microaggressions that come out, I think were very interesting to hear. And, for a book that made it so broadly across the mainstream media, I think it really provides a different perspective on what an Asian author could write about, other than stories like Tiger Mom and stories about kung fu and things like that. So I think I appreciated the book's a bit attempt to be different and be something more relevant for today's readers.
Yeah, you guys actually introduced the book to me, and once I bought it, picked it up, started reading it, I also finished it in less than a week. And I thought it was so interesting. Like you said, Max, the author is Asian herself, but the main character of the book is white. So having that juxtaposition is really, really interesting throughout the whole storyline. Parts of the story, they deep delve into social media and how that was like so toxic for June. Once she got her big break from her big book, she gets all of these, endorphins all at once from authors that praised her. And then a couple of months later, she gets, told that she may have plagiarized, and then her reputation went down the drain, and that was just so toxic to read. Do you think that fueled June's microaggression towards the Asian community during those scenes?
You mean after she knowingly plagiarized, that everything that happened to her after the fact made her low-key racist?
Exactly.
You don't think she was prior to her decision of stealing
I
Athena's work?
never thought so. I never got that sense from the intro of her in the beginning of the book, but what did you think? Did you think she was?
I thought she was always racist, and she was always jealous in many ways that she wouldn't admit to Athena's success. And when she mentions that this is now my book because I spent hours and days doing the research to back it up, and I modified it, and the most successful parts of the book were the parts I wrote, while completely invalidating the concept of the book, the frame of the book, all the the fact that she didn't find the topic on World War One Chinese workers, is a sign of generally how easily the works of visible minorities are often stolen by the mainstream, by folks in general. And it's just another sort of hit in the head for Chinese people, not being able to have their work be spoken for fully, and always having somebody else that's not Chinese tell their story. And so to me, that was a form of racism in a way, because she played into the stereotypes that already existed for Chinese folks.
I agree. I think maybe the word isn't necessarily racist, but it's embedded into the psyche of a majority when they can't have something specifically and then paint a victim story behind it. And there must be like real scientific sociology terms around this, but I see this often in different stories and narratives that we see in Hollywood, for example. Wasn't there like a character that Scarlett Johansson played and nobody batted an eye about it, where it was like clearly an Asian character, and it was kind of like, oops, sorry, like I didn't think any better. Like I was just trying to bring the artwork forward. And I don't think that just, like, for example, Scarlett Johansson is a racist actor or anything like that, but it's the lack of understanding and sympathy towards this type of behavior. You even think about things in history, like the British Museum is all stolen artifacts, right? Like why are mummies there? Don't those things belong to the Egyptians, for example? So this has been an ongoing issue of the majority claiming things that they really in their minds think belong to them, and are not considerate or don't know how to be considerate of the minority story. And so I agree with you, Max, that I think June just lacks that awareness from the get-go.
So here's a thought. If someone wanted to write about somebody else's experience and they're not from the same race, would you say that's taking away race or culture when it's not theirs and ethical to steal that?
It's fine when there's a level playing field and everybody has a chance to write those stories and present them. I think what is challenging is you have white authors that may, in this case, in the story of this book, they're writing about the Asian history or the Asian experience, when Asian authors are not offered the same opportunity to write stories that they want. Again, going back to stories from Amy Tan, for example, she's always being typecast into a specific type of fiction, always glorifying or talking about the Asian immigrant experience. If she wanted to switch field and write about something else, the big publishers, whom this book actually critiques quite a bit, Random House, um, Scholastic, whatever, they don't offer that same opportunity. And so, my view of this is, if, let's say, an Asian wants to write about this story and so does a white author, and both are afforded the same chances, then, it's fair. It's her game, it's equitable. But otherwise, certain experiences should be left by the folks who know it best.
I struggled with that. Like, I struggle with that question, Maria, but I do hear what you're saying, Max, and I think that makes sense. It kind of, if we look back through history, and let's just use historical comparables of issues like this, women in the past were not regarded as worthy to be authors. You look back at authors like L.M. Montgomery. She specifically used the initial LM, her name's Lucy Maud Montgomery, to write Anne of Green Gables because they thought that, the publishers thought that it would probably sell better and gain more respect from readers if they thought that it was a man, or at least it wasn't immediately viewed as a woman writing these stories. And so if we think about the parallels of women not getting the opportunity to tell stories, period, and then through time, seeing more and more women come up and write, and now openly publishing their names and not being disregarded right away because, oh, that's a woman's story, or that's a woman who wrote this story. Then I think through time, this situation, Max, that you raised about minorities not being able to write their stories would hopefully even out. And then there wouldn't be so much stigma around typecasting, or sorry, type, is that the word? Stereotypes around what one can and cannot write. Like, I think about, if for whatever reason tomorrow I wanted to be a writer and I wanted to write a story about people, and, because you can't write a story without specific details, I don't necessarily want to write about Vietnamese people. Am I going to then not be taken seriously because my characters are white or black or indigenous? I think about that and I don't know what the boundaries are, but having that level playing field so that everybody gets an even opportunity first, kind of like a first right of refusal, I think makes sense.
Interesting.
Yeah, like, where do you think the line is sort of between cultural appropriation and appropriating other people's stories, or, how far can an author go before they've reached that line of, they're being too insensitive or they're speaking out of line?
Yeah, that line is very gray. I think we've progressed a lot from history, and now we're at a better position to have a more quote unquote equal playing ground, but we still have a lot to flush out and make equality feel like equality. I think that goes to our workplace too, don't you think, Max and Kim? Whether that be you sit on the DEI committee, Max, and I think you speak to that topic often and really push for that initiative. But I think at the end of the day, what we want doesn't always translate into what we get in the work field. And I would say in the publishing industry, it's probably the same struggles and challenges that they face as well. So this story is very much multi-layered as well. It also talks about the publishing industry and how cutthroat it can be, and how social media plays a big role in making authors big or not big overnight. So in one of the scenes, June is challenged by a Chinese American reader on why she thinks it's okay to write and profit from painful Chinese history. The publisher then decides that June should now go by Juniper San, complete with an ambiguously ethnic author picture for the book. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts about this, and what does that say about the publishing industry? Although we're not in the publishing industry, maybe you guys can both give some examples of disadvantages that are parallel to our industry?
Well, first, I think changing it from June Hayward to Juniper Song was wrong. And the reason why is because it was a conscious decision. It wasn't an accident, because we learned that her real name is Juniper and her middle name is Song as a result of her mom. And this is the book's text, not me, but of her hippy dippy days, of thinking that it sounded like lyrical or something like that. So it's one thing for her to claim that this is on my birth certificate, but it's another thing for her to knowingly go with that moniker because the publishers thought that it would play off that minority ethnic angle better, right? So it's like kind of like manslaughter and premeditated murder, like you've made a plan and you've made a plan and you knowingly are going to execute. It wasn't an accident.
That did make her book sell millions of copies, right?
Isn't it interesting that here you have a white author trying to be more ethnically sounding, and then you have in real life immigrants taking on proper Canadian names to fit in more. What do you guys think of that? Put the other way, do you think it's right that folks would put their, maybe their, their country name or their national names aside to take on a more anglicized one?
So I looked this up, trying to educate myself prior to this podcast, and my Google search is like, is there such thing as racism between two minorities? Or like, what does racism mean? And some of the things that I got out of the readings that I found is that it really goes back to who is setting the playing ground, who is laying out the rules of the game. And if you think about it, racism comes from just, broad textbook term of a majority setting the terms and conditions and everybody else playing along. So if we think about it, it would be, and we look at history, right? The British Empire has set all these rules and boundaries throughout history, and everybody is just playing within those parameters. And if you don't play within it, then you're not in it, and you're exiled, and you're out. You're not part of the economy. You're not part of the market. You don't get to thrive. You don't get to be a part of whatever it is that success is in this society. So going back to what you posed then, Max, say somebody with an ethnic name changing their name is because it's out of need. It's out of hardship because they cannot thrive otherwise. When it's the reverse, it's frivolous because you already have that privilege and you are playing upon other people's hardships to get ahead when you are already ahead of the game.
Max, I feel like your question's directed to me, the ethnic person in the group that have the most white name.
I would say that's actually directed to all of us. Maria, I'm assuming, do you have a Chinese name? I don't know if
I
you do or
do.
not.
And
Okay, okay,
it was legally Chinese when I lived in England. And my parents
right.
chose to rename me to Maria because nobody could pronounce it. And to your point, Kim, they wanted me to play on a more even playing field with the rest of the team when it comes to being interviewed, when it comes to, being introduced to other people in the workforce. And I then personally chose to take on my Caucasian husband's white last name after we got married because I didn't want, well, first of all, I wanted to be upgraded from a Z to a B, but then, nobody can now pronounce my last name anymore.
I can't tell you how many times I've been in client meetings and we're like, oh, we reference, oh yeah, there's like a Burns on the team. And I'm like, that's not how you say it, but okay.
So yeah, I get where you're coming from, Max. It's unfortunate, right? Because if you cared about somebody's ethnicity, you would take the time to learn to say their name properly, but not many people do. So when it comes to working in a corporate environment, you kind of want to take the path of least resistance and just have a name that's easier to pronounce and that's more common.
Yeah. I mean, with my name, Kim is actually my legal middle name. And my parents wanted to register my whole entire name when I started kindergarten. And it was actually the registrar who asked them to think about it twice and then actually just went ahead and called me Kim because she felt like it was just going to be easier in life for me.
Wow.
And I didn't know this until my mom told me years later. She's like, yeah, I don't know why your tests, like when they come back, when your report cards come back and they don't actually show your full name because, she was probably fumbling through the registration itself.
Interesting.
Yeah. How about you, Max? Was that something that your parents decided on or did you have a say towards what you wanted to be called?
Yes and no. I remember, and this was like 3 months into our journey in Canada. It was 2 days before school, and they knew school started like September the 5th or something. It was like September the 3rd. We're sitting on the ground, and because we hadn't bought a bed yet, even, and I had to go to school. And my parents said, "Well, we got to give you a name that yourself can pronounce easily." So they whipped up this old English dictionary that they had, and they went through some of the common names. They're like Brad, no, Benjamin, no, too long, and they found the shortest three-letter name that they could find. And so that's how Mac came to be. But my parents never went ahead and registered it legally for probably the most reasonable reason, which is they didn't understand how to do it, and they never, and once we started into the school system, we just continued to go with it. So I've always maintained a different legal name. I couldn't tell you how many times growing up like that bothered me so much because I was also pretty much at the end of the list of the class list in most circumstances, and every year I would have a teacher butcher my legal name, and only for me to correct them to my give my more proper name. But now it doesn't bother me. Now I realize that names don't matter. That's my personal view, and there's many more ways to define yourself. And there's a lot of people out here that have a different legal name for all sorts of reasons.
My son has Vietnamese middle names. And yeah, it's going to be a pain when he does like standardized testing. He's got to fill out every single box for his full name. But I think that if I don't incorporate that, that loses a sense of where he comes from. And he may be born in Toronto and he may hold a Canadian citizenship, but he should know where he comes from. And maybe it's the nerd in me, but when people dig up bodies and whatnot and try to find information on not bodies, sorry, documentation and whatnot, they want to look at kind of, names and etymologies to see where people come from and whatnot. And that's like the biggest clue that anyone can leave behind. Clearly, I listen to a lot of cold case crimes and whatnot because I keep on dropping these.
I was gonna say this is well connected to your earlier comment about manslaughter and murder. Now corpses. Also mummies in a British museum. So the theme for the day.
There's a theme for tonight. Yeah.
I'm not the only one.
So Yellowface also raises questions about desire and greed and about privilege on both sides of the spectrum for white writers and diversity writers. As the protagonist says, it all boils down to self-interest, manipulating the story. If publishing is rigged, you might as well make sure it's rigged in your favor. Do you think June exerted her white privilege in her situation? And have you experienced white privilege occur in the workplace? Maybe that's a loaded question.
I think that this story oozes of privilege in and of itself, and it almost makes a mockery of it. I think the author acts on this assumption that, okay, like everyone that's reading the book can see and feel that already there's a ton of privilege, whether it's by race or by class or by upbringing. They could already relate, and they've already experienced being on the short end of the stick when it comes to privilege. So this is, this author has made a very great attempt at trying to show that how privilege plays out. But I think, broadly, obviously, privilege occurs everywhere in the workplace. That's why we do diversity and equity work, to try to mitigate those problems. Obviously, D&I work may never get to the root of these issues. Often they can be band-aids, and they'll help mitigate some of the differences between groups. But real privilege occurs when everyone attempts to either decolonize or really revisit some of their core assumptions about themselves and about other people. This is part of my opinion, but I think the setup of this book has been terrific for those reasons.
Yeah, I think from beginning to end, there were definitely themes of racism throughout the book, right? Maybe some of it was direct, some of it was indirect, because there was a scene where June experienced racism herself. So she was invited to a book club as a guest speaker, and the person who picked her up made an assumption that she was Asian or part Asian because number one, she wrote a book on Chinese history, and number two, she published her book under the name Juniper San, which was supposed to sound more Asian than her white name. So the person was then kind of disappointed that she wasn't Asian after finding out the truth. And in that scene, I kind of felt for June, right? That she experienced quote unquote reverse racism herself. Do you think we should even have sympathy for that particular scene?
I don't think that there's such thing as reverse racism. I think reverse racism is a misnomer. And I don't think it was a racist scene either. I think the fact pattern is she published a name that was Juniper Song. And so it was well within anybody's assumption that that was an ethnic name. You know, if we agree with what Max was saying at the beginning about equity and opportunity of telling stories, it would be fair that somebody who would go into such detail about a very specific minority's history would probably be someone who has had some sort of personal connection or yeah, I guess history or connection with it. And so I think what we're feeling, because I did feel a tinge of whatever it was in those scenes, and I think it was secondhand embarrassment for Juniper for going along with this charade for so long, and then it crashing and burning in front of her eyes. And her wanting to get out of there was not, oh, you know, there's so much racism towards me. I feel sick to my core because of how ugly these people are to the world and to me. I don't think it was that at all. It was, oh shit, I've been founded out. I need to get out of here before more things happen to me so that my success dwindles. I think that's what that is. Do you have any comments there about that scene and about quote unquote reverse racism, Max?
Yeah, I'm 100% in agreement with you. There is no such thing as reverse racism. You know, by your definition earlier, you know, you are when you're talking about racism, you're talking about a group of people that sets the dynamics for everybody else. And so because they set the dynamics, they are able to get into everyone's communities and get into everyone's narratives and nobody questions that. And so the systems that they operate in are really in their favor. And so by choosing to do this, they, you know, June bears the whole responsibility when it comes to any sort of embarrassment that she feels. I think the scene was designed, you know, Maria, to your point, the great scene that you picked up, by the way, it was designed to make you look at a person who has all the power doing something of their own volition and then feeling embarrassed about it. And it's making the authors realize, or it starts making the listeners realize, like, this is crazy. Like, how, you know, how much of a hypocrite are you? You know, you did this to yourself, but then you want to change a narrative so it looks like other people are faulting you for doing it when you were morally wrong in the first place. So might be a bit of a spoiler, but I think it was a very intentional scene.
Mm-hmm. Have you guys ever had an incident occur where you felt indirect or direct racism, whether that be at work or outside of work? And maybe you can share how you dealt with that situation.
I remember a time from, and this goes back to our previous episode about helping our parents and whatnot. Through the times that I have gone on different appointments and meetings with my parents as a child to do interpretation stuff, I did remember there was a doctor, some sort of specialist who was looking at my mom's hand. She had an injury. And as he was treating her, he had this look of disdain the whole entire time. And as a kid, I really didn't think much about it. I was like, what an old, ugly man. But I do remember what he said to us, which was, how long have you been in this country? For goodness sake, learn some English. And I didn't know how to respond to that. I didn't even know if it was appropriate to feel what I felt because he was from a position of authority and, you know, he's a doctor and I always have so much respect for doctors. But it would be moments like that throughout the years that I reflect on now that I've actually experienced quite a bit. And quite frankly, I've never really had a chance to defend myself against it. There was another time, sorry, when I was helping my parents move into their house, and I had parked in front of the neighbors. And mind you, the house is in front of an arterial road. And in Vancouver, you're allowed to park on the road if you are a resident. Otherwise, you need a permit. And, for all intents and purposes, we were a resident. And the occupant came out of the house and started yelling at me and saying all types of different racial slurs, and then said, "You're lucky my daughter's not home, or I'd have her beat your ass." And so this is when I was a grown adult, right? I was in my 20s, and I didn't know how to deal with that either. So I got in the car, told my sister to get in the car, and we drove away because I didn't want anything to happen to us. I spoke to a friend in the force afterwards, and he said, you should probably call the non-emergency line to report that. And so I did. And the first thing that the line told me was, okay, what's the house number? Give us the description. We're going to go knock on their door and talk about it and bring it up with them. I closed the case because I didn't want him, like, I don't know, breaking windows and egging our house. So I have all this pent up anger and resentment towards, such ugly people like this, but I've never really been able to seek, my own justice around it.
Well, it's a terrible thing to hear, actually, Kim, that you experience this as an adult. But it points to, I think, something which is so interesting is that, sure, you may have the tools to report situations like this within our system, but beyond that, there's daily consequences that are not just that the law cannot protect you from. For example, you closed the case because you didn't want further repercussions, because frankly, your parents live next door, and you are worried that they will suffer either trauma or harassment of any kind. And those are the real things. Like doing what's right does not mean you get the result that you want. And that's the dangerous outcome of subtle racism or indirect racism, which is you're still living in a state of fear. You're still worried that you won't get justice, even though you did everything that you were supposed to do.
And I think that happened to one of the characters in the book. I think it was the analyst or intern who picked up on June's racist undertones from the get-go, and she suffered the most. Maria, if you can recall what happened to her, and sorry, what was the character's name?
I don't remember her name, but she was fired, right? Because June didn't want her to review any further of the book to highlight all of those issues from the book. So I can't remember her name, but she was fired from that situation.
Yeah, I mean,
she never had a chance to speak up.
That's right. I mean, she did everything that textbook wise was correct. She suggested a diversity and equity reader, right? Somebody who just kind of blind reads it for any kind of questionable things that the publishing company needs to flag. And as a result, that would halt whatever the scheduled timing was, but it was in the name of good practice. Unfortunately, due diligence didn't work in her favor, and June wrote a scathing email directly to, I think it was Danielle or Daniela, the public Candace, that's her name. That's the character's name. Wrote a scathing email, and then instead of being commended for her due diligence, she got sacked like the next day, and then couldn't find work anywhere because she was blacklisted.
That's right. Yeah, which leads to actually the ending of the story, which was, in my opinion, not well. The loose ends didn't really tie up, or it felt really rushed. But essentially, it turns out she was a Korean American editor, and her name was Candace Lee, and she was apparently behind the whole thing of trying to make June fear for her life, because June thought, Athena was coming back to haunt her as a ghost and whatnot. And she cooked up a revenge plot after June gets her fired for suggesting that June's team gets a Chinese sensitivity reader, like you mentioned, Kim, for the book. What do you guys think of the climax? I personally didn't love it. I thought it could have been written in a different plot twist. But then again, they needed to end the book somehow.
I think this book is, once more, I think, great at getting into the head of how racism or colonialism plays out in real life society, and how, who are the actors that really keep it going today? What were the thoughts? And it portrays it very well in the sense of, some of the thoughts that lead to perhaps stereotypical situations are not intentionally so. It just happens that certain people who are in power think a certain way. Um, Overall, though, I agree with you, Maria. It's a very abrupt ending. It doesn't really close the loop in terms of the villains and the story. The ending where people get injured and get pushed downstairs and all that sort of stuff is not very realistic, which contrasts the realism that exists in the book in the earlier half of people copying ideas and people exercising their white privilege. So it's, I think it disappoints people who were really here for that story.
So the literary nerd in me is going to come at this from a different angle. And I think that the ending had enough of a open-endedness to it that I think the book needed. And quite frankly, I think it's a commentary on how racism and the ongoing issues of it is still an open-ended issue. An open-ended
Because
matter.
of how other people perceive the matter. Is that what you mean?
I mean, like, racism has not been solved. I think we can all agree on it. It's still an ongoing issue. And, in some places where we think we've done better as society, we've gone 3 steps back, right? And I think that the ending, the open-endedness of it mirrors the current state of how society is. And if we look further into it, I think we read towards the end about how June gets this second wind of it's not the end for her. She's going to basically return with a comeback story, because everybody likes a comeback story. And instead of feeling defeated and wanting to bury herself into the ground and seeing how she's ruined her reputation and probably the rest of her writing career, she has this interesting sense of encouragement and excitement. An unpopular opinion, but I think that this is exactly a commentary on how the majority feels. Because if we look at something close but not so parallel, such as the Chanel Miller case, the woman who was sexually assaulted on the Stanford campus a few years ago, her attacker is a male athlete. And even though it was a heinous crime, right, we can all agree, right, she's left with this trauma. She was left out back behind a dumpster. She didn't die, but obviously, like, she was discarded there before somebody found her and got some help. The attacker went to court and he got off with a slap on the wrist, something along the lines of "boys will be boys." And so if we take that type of feeling and ending of a story like that and place it to the end of this book, it's a commentary on how if Athena really was an ethnic minority, that probably would have been the end for her. But because Juniper Song can turn into June Hayward, it's not the end. It's a different angle, because she's got enough people behind her to take her side, because she is the majority. So therefore, mathematically, she will have more supporters behind her, depending on the angle that she takes. So I thought, although the story doesn't give us a definitive ending that we can take home, that was kind of what I took away at the end.
That is to say, the rules are in her favor, and if in the favor of people who are just like June. That they designed the system, it catered to what they want, and they will always have a second shot at redemption, because if they wanted to, they can go out and go to any magazine, any book publisher, and they would love to have that comeback story. Which is an opportunity that doesn't exist for everybody.
Well, how do you guys think we can try to rewrite the rules of society to try to make the playing field more equal for all of us in the future? I know it takes time and baby steps, one day at a time, but we got to start somewhere. Having, companies support this initiative and speaking out is definitely one positive step forward, in my opinion. And Max, I think you do a really important job at our company for that initiative.
I think at large, I think there's a lot of folks in this space that are trying their best to amend the rules of the game so that it's fair to everybody. There's a lot of good-hearted people, and there's a lot of folks who are willing to listen and change. But change is slow. Asking folks who feel they've been very righteously placed in positions of power to change is not easy. And I think we can all understand the different angles, to it. I think everybody wants to believe that hard work is key to their success, and no one gets uplifted to any particular position. It's hard to perhaps see privilege when, either you benefit from it or you yourself have never exercised that privilege consciously in your life. So it's not easy to make that change. But I do think that this generation is different. I think each generation gets one step closer towards this. And, as the power dynamics of the world changes, we'll get closer to dismantling some of the colonization that exists in our workplaces, in our society at large. So we'll get there, but it might be a Gen Z thing, or Gen Alpha, like your children. They might be the ones who can fully reap the benefit.
Actually, Alpha now.
Yeah.
Gen Alpha.
Gen Alpha.
So we're going to the beginning of the alphabet again.
Basically. We're restarting. All right. Well, to wrap this up, thank you, Max and Kim, for your insightful thoughts and helping me dissect this book. Love our conversations as always.
Okay. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for this fruitful conversation as always. I didn't think that we'd be doing a book report 3 episodes in, but here we are. And with that, it's a wrap. Thanks, everyone.
Minor Things is an original podcast and can be found on YouTube and Spotify. Music credits to Soundstripe. Follow Minor Things Podcast, all one word, on Instagram and provide feedback. We'd love to hear from you.
I'm a passion fruit. I'm like white on the outside, yellow on the inside.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a fruit like that.